anonymous donor whose bequest has given us the resources to be able to have such a fantastic lineup this spring. First with our guest, TORKWASE DYSON, followed by Leslie Loco on February 24th, Joel Sanders on March 20th, and Mira Henry on March 30th. I'd also like to thank the folks from the School of Architecture who have helped bring this series to fruition. Our interim head, Blaine Brownell, there you are. And our fantastic staff of Mava Jones, Bob Gluns, Nicole Kennedy, Amelia Narragon, Lori Malberg, and Sam Reed, and students Hannah Bushyhead and Joyanna Hooks and Hannah Packard. Thank you. So last semester, we had an excellent lecture series organized by the Women in Architecture Student Organization, or WISO. Shout out to you all. And I hope you see this semester's series as an extension of the enriching dialogue begun with their hard work. This semester's series is titled Interfaces. An interface is a point where two systems, subjects, institutions, or organizations meet and interact. So see that? Look at that, magic. Thank you, Clay. So the lecture series itself as a format or system becomes a didactic mechanism for us to consider architecture's intellectual reproductive dialogue. Each of our four speakers is dealing with difference in incredibly productive and groundbreaking ways. And my hope is that we're all enriched by the expansive conversation and the fact that it's happening face to face. So to give you a little preview, the format for tonight and the series in general is a guest lecture followed by conversation with University of Minnesota faculty, in this case, Associate Professor of Art Diane Willow and myself. Then we'll open things up with a general Q&A before heading out to a reception in the lobby. Also, just want to make sure everyone knows that each lecture will be followed by an opportunity for students to have a more focused and intimate conversation about the issues raised in the lectures at a lunchtime discussion on each Tuesday following the lectures. So those are going to be held in Rapson 225 at noon. Lunch will be served, hungry students. So come for pizza and a chance to reflect on the issues raised in the talks. So our first speaker is artist TORKWASE DYSON. Though working in multiple forms, Dyson describes herself primarily as a painter, whose compositions address the continuity of movement, climate change, infrastructure, and architecture. For Dyson, these subjects in relationship to each other produce abstractions that explore the history and future of Black spatial liberation strategies and environmental racism. As we architects consider the potency and potential of representational strategies to open up space for new futures, I think TORKWASE's work offers a map in a way. Within her practice, she has developed a unique vocabulary of abstract lines, forms, shapes, and edges, informed by her own evolving theory of Black compositional thought. These explorations of how the body unifies, balances, and arranges itself to move through natural and built environments become both expressive and discursive structures within the work. She examines the legacy of plantation economies and their relationship to the environmental and infrastructural issues of our current age, which many characterize as the Plantationocene. This term, Plantationocene, is an alternative to the term Anthropocene, acknowledging that colonialism, capitalism, and enduring racial hierarchies inform our ways of being in the world today. Dyson draws a connection between the abstract forms of her art and the networks of industrialized white supremacist power that shape our landscape. Histories of spatial segregation, policing and vagrancy laws, and other exclusions of subjectivity that often hide in the abstractions of machines, maps, policies, and data. Her practice takes up abstraction as a tool for reshaping our current landscape and reimagining these systems from within. Please join me in welcoming TORKWASE DYSON.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jennifer, for doing so much work to bring me here, and I look forward to the conversation. I want to start off with drawing and end with architectural projects that I've done a few years ago, maybe up to 4 or 5 years ago now, and focus that way to really communicate how drawing is a sort of engine around the practice, and where I find myself learning both systems and the kind of visceral and haptic conditions that systems sort of reveal based on human beings pushing against them. So I have way too many slides, so I'm going to go through them as a way to get to a conversation. And if you see a slide that you want us to return to, please make a note of it, and during the conversation, we'll do just that. Right. So I want to start with the drawings that I've titled the hypershaped drawings. And hypershaped drawings come from an amalgamation of shapes that I've taken from people who were enslaved and self-liberated through architectural spaces. So what they essentially are these historical narratives at a combination or access point of Box Brown, Harriet Jacobs, and Anthony Burns. Box Brown escaping in the box, Harriet Jacobs escaping in a garret, and Anthony Burns escaping from a hull of a boat. So the curve, the triangle, and the square become really signifiers in the work that I sort of toss around, right? And I use them in a way to create different kinds of shapes and forms as I go, and they make their way into my paintings. So drawing is a way, and drawing these sort of hyper-shaped conditions are a way to keep my body loose while I'm drawing, but keep my mind locked on a kind of Black history that I look to understand more deeply because of our troubling climate future. And I think in those futures, and in the future, we will find really amazing solutions by looking at the Black spatial history. So, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. These are all gouache on paper. Some of them have ink, some of them, very few of them have graphite. They come from a system where I'm working wet, and I let those wet marks dry, and I go immediately onto the diagrammatic lines. And I'm doing this, timing myself. So they're this sort of record of time where the diagrammatic lines tend to be made under a minute. I set a clock, I try to get it down as a way to keep the improvisation happening. So from these smaller drawings, I make larger drawings that then have that wash mark, that are very much about distance and space and movement and motion. Again, gouache and ink on paper. So what you have in the drawing and in my practice is a continuous amalgamation of ideas around systems that have been abstractive, histories of movement that have been abstracted, all based also around this idea of liquidity, water, oil, and liquidity as it moves through the planet. And that has also to do with industry runoff. It also has to do with water. It also has to do with, again, crude oil. So all of this focus around liquidity is a sort of an amalgamation of how we think or how we use or how we push these liquids through the planet, using the ocean as super highways and looking at these ways and how does this liquidity affect our individual lives. So I go from the drawings to my printmaking practice where I teach myself the idea of the water table. And through an architectural lens, I use section drawing. So I choose an arbitrary home. I sort of break it apart, and I think about what's under the home, what's under the thing that's under the home, and what's under those things and how they bleed into the planet, depending on the geographic location and depending on the history of both industrial waste sites, old extraction conditions of inner urban spaces, things that happen around heat islands and sort of sewage runoffs. So all of these are things that I'm interested in when I'm thinking about producing these images. So what ends up happening is this relationship between abstraction and representation that I continuously sort of juggle around in my work. And I'm generally discomforted by the work when it ends up something towards a kind of representation that that makes something look fixed, that makes an object look fixed or unmovable, right? So when I end up doing that, because something is going on with the composition, I sort of combat that fixity with different kinds of spatial line weights and marks and things like that. So I'm constantly, even with large, dense, heavy objects, thinking about them as temporary, thinking about them before they were at that site, and thinking about how waters and may push them under and move them slightly, breaking ground and things of that nature. So these are the kind of moments in the work where sort of this wet practice lends me into thinking about shape really critically, and how the more viscous and the more expressive marks then lead into the harder shaped lines. And what I tend to do from drawing to printmaking is also make these sort of sculptural objects that also have to do with the hypershape. I'm interested in this idea of the modularity, the modular movement, of course, and making and sort of taking, when I'm in the wood shop, these remnants that are sitting around the wood shop and just shaping them by hand, sort of freestyling, and making these moments that from one piece, there's another piece, and I make a sort of 1 and 2 object in the round. So these pieces are pretty small. They were at the Drawing Center. And later I showed them at the Graham Foundation as a way to think about how I, as a painter, would make a model, not knowing how to make a model. So these are sort of my adventures into teaching myself how to make models. So different angles. And these would be models of sculptures. Okay. So here are the shapes that I've sort of gotten into as I study Black bodies of descent. The cube, the rectangle, and the curve. Here's an image of the architectural space where Harriet Jacobs hid. Here are multiple Google images of Box Brown. And I don't have an image of Anthony Burns just because they weren't really available. So what happens when I move these shapes in the round and I start, begin to thinking about how other bodies embody these shapes that are based on these histories. So I've come up with the trapezoid, and as a form, as a shape that I'm dealing with now as a way that embodies all of these shapes that I'm dealing with. I haven't yet resolved where that curve exists, except when I'm putting on the surface of the sculpture. I'm wrapping other materials around them. So that touch, that hand, that haptic moment in relationship to the trapezoid is where the sort of hypershapes unfold. And how I dissect these histories is still an ongoing practice. So without an image of Burns's ship, I often make it up in my head and fold it out, and again use a sort of section technique to think about what is above, what is below, what is through, what is behind, what is reflection, what is touch, right? What is quiet. Because one of the things about being in that hull of a ship was his absolute necessity for silence and smallness and understanding what negative and positive space was in the dark, moving with the motions of the ship I can imagine, and then doing this over and over again because he escaped during the fugitive slave law. So his enslaver would come get him and then take him back. So he made this journey 3 times. So this piece is a way to think about what, speculate, how to unfold these cargo ships. This was not a ship built or evolved into enslaving people. It was a cargo ship that held rice and grains and things like that. So I'm going to skip a little bit to direct water work to talk about a little of my research practice. So thinking about bodies of descent as it pertains to the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery, I'm really committed to understanding infrastructure with those systems and those architecturals, but also the current relationship with extraction points and oil extraction and gas extraction, and how, again, we move liquid through the planet. So I dive in the Gulf Coast as a certified scuba diver to lay my eyes and put my body in this idea of weight. So often I know that this diving and navigating water and navigating these kinds of lines that deal with infrastructure and these sort of massive structures that both have an architectural unit, an infrastructural unit, and an oceanography unit, right? So it collapses all of these ideas in my practice that I find really valuable. And I wonder, of course, like what's underneath. So what's under the steel has become what they call a artificial reef. And the irony is that the same massive structures that obliterated screen life because of the growth of coral, which fluctuates depending on geography, has become a site where marine life has returned. Where the coral is healthy, the marine life returns. Where it's not, of course, with the warming of the planet and the warming of water, a lot of the coral sites have been bleached out and have totally lost their color. Here's an image of the extraction sites in the Gulf of Mexico alone. So thinking about water and throughways, these are the paintings that came out of that work, right? So what happens is I was interested in thinking about, again, the curve. What you see still is Harriet's triangle and some rectangle shapes in there, all sort of based around this movement. So this is a lot of brushwork where I'm moving my body across the canvas, and I'm also using a lot of hard materials to move the paint across the canvas. It's also a wet process where I put down the wet materials first, and then I apply and then integrate the wet materials, the under painting, the washes, with these drier kind of marks to have a sort of both moment of representation, ideas of distance, but also bring the painting into the present. So the more points of impasto where the painting is in our space in relationship to marks that give a visible, whether it's scale or size of the marked distance within the same canvas. So I'm interested in that logic, and I'm interested in how Black people in particular in these stories have negotiated real-time devastation and devastation from memory, and real-time ideas of immediacy in body and flesh as it, in relationship to what we think about as distance or the future or something that you couldn't even imagine geographically where one would go. So, you know, this combination or this relationship between contemporary modes of abstraction, contemporary modes of trade and movement, exhausting of natural materials, very much to me talks about the transatlantic slave trade as the Black body was seen as a material. We weren't seen as human. So, and this idea of resource, extraction, exploitation, body, flesh has to objectify. You have to have a system of objectification to remove the humanity from an individual, and that has happened to people of color all over the planet. So we share in that abyss, right? People of color share in the abyss of being dehumanized, and we all have our own particular gateways into pushing back and decolonizing these kinds of aggressive conditions. So we share in that struggle as well. So one of the things that I'm thinking about as a person who makes paintings and drawings is where I think about these shapes in the round. So I landed on this mode of architectural sculpture because I wanted to make an object where an individual could embody a shape that was in relationship to the hypershapes. So an individual would walk up the ramp that's 6 feet tall, 6 feet, and there's a platform there, and you would look up, and there, the ceiling, the enclosed space is full of black plexiglass, right? And that plexiglass would start above the head. So you wouldn't be able to see yourself. And the way the plexi is engineered in the inside, you couldn't necessarily look up and see yourself also. So I was very aware, even though I was creating a condition where light was reflected in an architectural space, it wasn't important to me that the viewer see oneself in that reflection, but rather an idea of abyss in space. And it was impossible to take photographs inside of it. It was just impossible, so I don't even try. So I invite people with the description and I give and how people talk about it to maybe use your imagination and what that may feel like or be like sensorially. But the camera, you couldn't, it was either abyss or a light from the flash, and both of those were sort of false sensory conditions within this architectural moment. So I just let it be. This piece is called Residence Time, and I named it after this phrase that Christina Sharp coined in her book, In the Wake. And what it talks about is this idea of a Black body being in a ship and over a ship, and the time it takes for the body to transition not only into death, but into a particle state. So that residence time in the ocean is also something I'm thinking about in terms of a place where Black bodies go off of an architectural condition that a boat is, or a boat construction is, into another dark space. So we're still working on that idea of residence time, but I just wanted to make that note that this piece is to be continued. All right, so I'm really gonna kind of zoom through these now because I've been talking 6 minutes. Okay, sorry. Another piece that I made at Columbia, where was I? Colby College, where you see the trapezoid, and the trapezoids sort of meet the paintings, and you have the water table paintings up against these trapezoidal shapes. And this piece was called Nautical Dusk, to think about ideas of ocean, ideas of objects in ocean, ideas of overlooking the ocean and what that would be like. So here's a ramp where people could walk on it, sit in it, and those Black pockets were there for individuals to sort of, walk up the ramp, have a respite, take a moment, and then look out upon the sculpture itself. So the objects were organized in the space, so I knew the pieces that would be embodied, both the ones in the gallery that I invited people to enter, touch, look inside of, and the sculpture that is then sort of giving the audience a gaze into what I would consider a distant space that considers both horizon and architectural moments on the ocean as it pertains to the history of transportation, ships, things like that. So here's a still from a performance that was happening. And oftentimes my work starts with a sculpture, and then I collaborate with other artists, and we make performances based on the work or the project that someone invites me into, right? So my performance collaboration is called Dark Adaptive, and that's myself, Andres Hernandez, and Zachary Fabry. So the three of us sort of work around these sort of sculptural objects that I make over time. So questions of space. I'm going to shift to a project that I was invited to do at the Sharjah Biennial, and they cited me at Kalba. So I'm going to show this image, and you'll see that the site and the geography that the sculptures are next to. So it's, for me, a great moment where you see architecture, you see the sculpture, you see water, you see infrastructure, all of this in one geographic site. For me, that is really a kind of powerful moment. So we just went over an ice factory that's located at Kalba. And then that was the sculpture. I'll show you more of those. And then that sculpture was next to an environmental research center, a protection center. That line there is a wall that separates the runoff because I'll just go into that. So I was aware of this location, and I'm gonna start it over. So the ice factory was to the left as we look at it, to the sculptures. And then the sculptures were facing out into the water, which leads into the Indian Ocean, which is the Gulf of Oman. And Oman is one of the largest extraction sites on the planet. And so this wall was built by engineers to, I'm sorry, I interrupted. This wall was built by engineers to keep some of the runoff, the gook, from running into the environmental protection site. But imagine, like this is the Gulf of Oman that leads into the ocean, and this, in a worldview eye, this very small area that's protected by Environmental Protection Services. And that bridge crossed from what is Kalba into a very exclusive hotel site. So Kalba is going on this huge development, people moving from Sharjah to Kalba because Sharjah is no longer affordable. So they're making different kind of living decisions and moving out to Kalba because there's more sites to develop. There's more sites to develop, and it's a history of an urban kind of condition that exists in Kalba already. So I made, here you see the trapezoids again, that I'm using now as sort of viewing systems. So in all of the stories that I pull from, what's in common is every fugitive always found a way to look out of the thing that they were in. So Jacobs burrowed a hole, Box Brown burrowed a hole, and Burns sort of figured out how to situate himself. So the reflection of the oil on the objects in the crates, where he could have some kind of reflection, right, against this matte, liquid, wet area at the bottom of the ship, right? But I think that was a sort of genius, and it's a way to think about these dark materials having different surface quality, just to recognize a glimmer, to know that time is shifting in a dark space. So here's Dark Adaptive performing in Kalba on the piece. This is called I Can Drink the Distance. I think this is called I Can Drink the Distance. But I've made a couple of shows around distance, because often people ask me about time in my work, or how time relates to history and narrative and memory. But I'm more interested in thinking about ideas of distance and the idea that we don't always know what time is on our bodies, and we may. But I'm interested in thinking about how we wear distance on the body, how we wear journey on the body, how we wear travel on the body, which I think hasn't been talked about as much as we think about time. And as a person of color, the idea of distance and movement and migration and borders, I think distance on the body is a question, is a philosophical question that needs to be dealt with. Let's see. All right. So thinking about these two ideas of the curve between Richard Serra and Northern Kenyan woman who use these sort of architectural ideas to build, one in relationship to industry and the other in relationship to systems, in that the Tuareg woman built architectural structures to move other people around geographies, right? So one is very much about modularity, setting up a camp, helping other entities or group of people move geographically across lands. The other, Richard Serra, of course, whose father was a shipbuilder to move different materials across waters. So these sort of relationships of the curve and how we make the curve, one is very much industrial, one is very much haptic. In my journey as an abstract artist and a person who regards these Black spatial history as genius, it's to sort of merge the two, right? And talk about resistance in that merging, and talk about what does it mean to perceive both at the same time and more in the way my ancestors did, right? To have a sensoria, a moment of sensoria, and have to act at the same time, to say loose and focused, loose and engaged at the same time, right? In moments of terror. So how do you think about that in the language of painting? Well, so here I am, I've settled on the trapezoid, and what I'm doing now, like the shapes, I'm tossing and turning it, trying to think about ways in which to create a phenomenological experience with this shape that has to do with embodiment, that has to do with distance, and has to do with transformation and modularity. So here are paintings where I think I'm tossing these shapes around. So you see the trapezoid, you see the rectangles, you see the triangles happening in space, and in, to some extent, real time. You see the liquidity, you see all these moments of language of painting sort of overlapping. So one of the processes that are happening now is I'm working very wet, the painting's on the ground. I have all these histories in my mind, and then they dissipate, and then there's me and the painting. So that there's some immediacy there, that there's some improvisation there. And then I go on top of the solid shapes and then deal with the sort of liquid surface as well. So these varying kind of conditions are happening at the same time, never forgetting ideas of the water table, never forgetting ideas of the hypershape, never forgetting ideas of the horizon line and architecture, and all these things living in an ecosystem that Black people historically have defied, pushed against, and beat often. So when I'll talk about this a bit. So what happens now with the drawings, I'm able to settle on this shape, animate it, and draw in real time from these moving images. So I've gone in the practice from this sort of pragmatic way of working to thinking about and using this moving image to sort of follow the line in real time. And oftentimes we call it contour drawing, and oftentimes we call it draw it in a minute. But what is it to try to negotiate three moving shapes at the same time and try to make a drawing from them? Well, it's a mess. But what reveals itself is that sort of coordination and that looseness and the improvisation and the notion of movement and not understanding or being able to predict the direction oftentimes, but being able to sort of in the moment land a mark or land a motion or land a movement and allow those things to overlap and create this kind of really thick ideas and surfaces. So painting, sculpture, here are the shapes, here are the paintings. This is plexi. We have the trapezoid here. We have 4 paintings together. My sort of relationship to graphite, acrylic, metal, on canvas. I'm supposed to have a blank slide in there, but now I'm gonna stop now, and I'm just going to not say much. But these are my early architectural. So all the paintings and all the work you saw came after all of this work. So when I was doing this work, I was not painting. I was not making drawings rigorously. It was not happening. I was only focused on like getting solar power and autonomous spaces to people of color so they could do their thing. It wasn't a social practice necessarily. It was just me living my life, and architecture was a tool where I could do good. So the grassy knoll, I was like, oh, people can come and plug in and get off-grid solar unit. I'm gonna skip this. The Studio South Zero, this tiny studio I made out of garbage from other museums after exhibitions. It's also solar powered. Oh, that's why I included this, the cladding. I know you all call that cladding. The cladding on this small box is the surface of this, right? That's why I put that there. Okay, I couldn't remember. Okay, but that's why I put that there. So we had, the lights. We had a flower box. That's me working in the space. That's other people working in the space. Diane, I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. Diane, no. Oh my goodness. Purifoy. I'll remember her name in a second. But a dear friend of mine, so I'm horribly embarrassed, sought me out because she was doing interviews on people in the southern United States, on environmental injustice, new kinds of colonizations in the South, total displacements of communities, underdeveloped infrastructures, water problems, all of that happening in the South now. So this was Studio South Zero, and all of the studios sort of made a place. My sister took that picture. That's like my sister's personality. She put me as her personality. So Simone, that's her dog, cute dog too. She was like, let Bo get in there. And I'm like, okay, I'll do my hair that day. So this is Studio South Zero at the time, it was the Astor's place. This was before Rebuild Foundation had really exploded. But he let me build this little space under a tree. And I was teaching myself. He was like, these are my architectural dreams. And I'm gonna change the world. And we're never gonna worry about a place to create and work. I'm gonna make them all. So I invited people in to experiment, make sound. This was another off-grid. I'd found the materials. It's a sailboat, of course, because I'm always hunting, sailing things on water. So I found this beautiful sailboat that we cladded the bones with and did some cutouts. Here's the last one I'll show, which is the largest one and the first big failure that I had done. It was up a day and it was taken down. All kind of codes. I ran into code issues that I thought I had checked, but not. But the ambition was there. So we had built this, it's an organization called the Mural Arts Foundation. And this is when they started commissioning public works. So I built this with a group of young people, designed it with a group of young people with the intent of them programming it, curating it, and using it. Again, solar powered, all found material. This was cool. They wanted to program their sound and music there. So I said, well, let's lay down and do it. So I built I don't know what to call it, but I was like, okay, we can have both, shade and then lay on this soft thing. That's our install, and that's it. So.
Sure how fluid it will be to go back and forth to do slides. Make that happen. Thank you so much for your talk and for sharing some the sort of multivalent nature of your practice, like showing the architecture, the painting, the sculpture. I don't know exactly how we're going to do this with two. I feel like I've talked a lot.
No. Yeah, we can just pass it amongst ourselves. Yeah, I mean, I have just one initial question. You didn't mention it in the talk now, but earlier you mentioned that you have an alphabet that you work with, and that you have collaborations with people who have very different bases of knowledge or experience, architects, philosophers, others, and that you have this alphabet that you bring into those experiences. It's your way of working. And I was curious about how that transforms or shifts or doesn't through those collaborations and conversations.
The alphabet is
Can I pass it to
essentially,
you?
I think I might.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. He might be.
Good.
Right? Okay.
Thank you.
So the alphabet is basically the hypershapes, right? So I pretty much work in solitude. When I'm invited to do something, I make an object and then I pass the object to my collaborators.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't see what's happening after it leaves my hands. So I pass the sculptural idea to Andres, and Andres makes the score, whether it's a drawing score, a sound score. And then he passes that score to Zachary Fabry. And I don't see it until the performance happens.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that also connects to this larger idea of improvisation, which you talk about in so many different ways. And I was wondering, when you begin a new work, what the role of improvisation is at the very beginning when it's unclear where you're going.
Well, I think you arrive at improvisation, right? So if I'm prepared in the studio and I've done my work, then I get to a place where improvisation is the only place I can go to exhaust the possibilities of what's happening in front of me. But I don't, it kind of comes to me while the work is happening. So I have to know what the material can do and will do. I have to know what the form can do and won't do. And then I have to push those things together in the practice pretty rigorously to get to a place where I can then let improvisation in. So it's that way. Does that answer?
Yeah, totally. It reminds me of how you talked about using that 1 minute limit. So in a way, creating these conditions that make things emerge or create the possibility of things emerging. Yeah, thank you.
So this is hard with like passing it off. But I don't know, one of the things we were talking about when we kind of had a phone conversation beforehand was I was like, you're everywhere with architects, you know, and you're like, I'm always so surprised that they invite me. Like that architects are interested in my work. And I mentioned to you that part of, at least what I saw was compelled by when I looked at your work and I saw the exhibition at the Drawing Center in New York, was that I'm kind of directly confronted with a sort of visceral perceptual experience that focuses my attention in really like particular ways that just draw my attention and my focus. And so they engage my body as a sort of sensorial apparatus in very specific ways. So I told you that the work stands as a provocation to our presentness in the room. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that and the way you're kind of manipulating or otherwise influencing our perception. I mean, you talked a bit about depth and reflectivity and the kind of abyss of space and the way in which you're manipulating material. But maybe if you could talk about it in the context of audience, like, is that, I think it's very interesting when you said that your collaborations are, I do my thing in my lane, and then I pass it to the next person, and they do their thing in their lane, and then they do. So, yeah, maybe if you could talk a little bit about audience. Are you making work for someone, something, somewhere?
I get that question a lot. And this is what I've come up with today, is that the work, again, is driven by understanding these histories in a particular way to think about present spatial conditions. So the idea of studying Black spatial histories to get to solutions around present spatial issues is my journey as an artist. And so there's a level of comprehension that I have to work through to understand how complex that was, how many levels it was. So painting helps me figure that out. It helps me figure out systemic order. There are multiple conditions happening simultaneously. It helps me figure out how people preempt a space, how someone can think about a space 20 years in the future and have that navigated and experienced in real time to produce a certain economy and a continued degradation. And then in that 20-year plan of, and plus of creating systems of degradation, how a 16-year-old or 20-year-old person can slip through all of that, right? And what does that mean? And I think that as it pertains to audience, I think that as I understand these histories and these systems towards solution, I am hoping that I am creating an audience who wants to understand it too. And so painting is a way, I can do that because I can make paintings. Right?
Those are the tools you have.
Yeah, those are the tools that I have. And the history of painting is very much a culprit in thinking about how perspective function, thinking about how human beings become logical or presented as animals in their life. So those kinds of histories of propaganda within paintings and kind of representations of ideals in painting, that's what I was taught as a artist who was interested in art history. So I think those are powerful conditions. And then you move into a sort of contemporary condition where those ideas of representation are seen through different art historical movements have shifted. So when I land into geometric abstraction and I land into a sort of movement, like a concrete movement, then it becomes a politic that I can then sort of deconstruct through these tools that I have. So I'm thinking that people know that. And for those who don't know those histories and who are coming in it sort of through the side like I am, then we can think about this together. And some people just like looking at well-constructed paintings. So I'm very aware of that too, and I do too. So when I do leave all of those conceptual ideas behind when I'm working, right, with my tools and improvisation comes up, I understand that I'm going to make, the idea is to make a strong painting that can stand semi-autonomously on a wall as an object and that trigger people's perceptual conditions, right? And yeah, so audience is tricky for me, it's a tricky question because there are different registers of audienceship, it's different registers of how people perceive things on walls, different registers of legibility, different registers of preferences so I can't keep up with all of that. Yeah. So I'm interested in regarding these Black spatial conditions as genius, so I'm pushing through that line. So all the indexes that come out of that, I'm interested in as well. But
So I think it's really compelling that you kind of, in terms of the chronology of the presentation, right? You started with the present, then moved back to what came before. And so to kind of complete that loop, right? Like the more recent work like operates at a particular kind of like intimate scale of the body, right? Like its dimension. I mean, you think of like Tony Smith's Die or something, it's like 6 by 6 by 6. Like there's a kind of immediacy of like my dimension as a person. And so I'm wondering, especially because you showed the kind of architectural work, it kind of begs the question, like, are you interested in going back outward to a kind of environmental, dare I say, architectural scale? Yeah, I'm just curious, like, what might that look like for you, or how might it change or evolve given the circle of the process that you've gone through? And maybe to kind of condition the answer, or at least add another provocation to the question, is thinking about architecture in terms of the weather and the architectural envelope. The weather is a specific term that I know that you have engaged with in particular ways. And so when we think about architectural space and the need to condition and to, create a kind of enclosure, like what does that mean in the context of the weather?
So, as it pertains to the weather, I do go back to Christina Sharp's In the Wake, and when she talks about the wake of the ship and the experiences of time on the ship, crossing the Atlantic over months, and the weather conditions changing. And a lot of literature and historical essays focus on, and poetry focusing on those shifts of weather. So I'm interested in stories where writers have positioned the main character and someone that has figured out what weather does to material. And in that figuring out towards a liberatory movement, you have to have those, that haptic indelibly printed on your memory, right? So you have
to survive.
To survive. So you have to understand the difference between old wet wood and new wet wood, right? Between a loose rope and a tight rope, like things are the circle, right? Climbing inside the hole, climbing back inside the hull of a ship from the circle of a side ship, you know. So that history of weather as it pertains to Black literary practices and the social sciences, the way I think through those will probably be through more architectural conditions, because they help me understand it. And it helps me, and I think with the history of East African architecture as it pertains to the Tuareg women of northern Kenya, people who are interested in pastoral movement architecture. It's like, okay, so how do you do that? And oftentimes when I'm invited to architectural summits or whatever, when people are speaking of, new materials and how do we make sustainable architecture that deals with weather conditions, and then they show up with these shapes and these materials that are absolutely from the continent, it boggles my mind that they position it as something inventive. So I'm aware that I have to combat that, because that's a form of delay. Like that white architectural material performance around an invention, for me, is a delay in knowledge, right? If it's already there, and I'm just looking in the wrong place, and these things need to be understood, right? In the way I understand the relationship between art and architecture, if there's a complete absence of indigenous architecture, then you're causing me a delay and I'm leaving. So I'll catch you on the other side when there's something technology as it pertains to institutional, massive institutional think tanks that could come up with that technology. And then I'll say, okay, now that's something that in this condition couldn't have been possible. But all of these other conditions already,
right, they're already here.
You're already ignoring them. So there's a way to think about someone like Tony Smith who understood the limitations of American architecture and got to smoke from this work around the tetrahedron because he was searching for a phenomenological experience that American architecture did not offer.
Was not giving him.
So that's what I'm on. Like, I'm on the Tony Smith, you know, boat and the Tuareg women. Like, those are the human beings that I'm trying to follow into why I should make something.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about like the historical legacy of painting. I mean, architecture has its own like limited trajectory, right, in terms of how it defines itself. And so I think certainly the things that you're talking about of recognizing like other epistemologies, like there are other ways of knowing, there are other ways of defining myself as architect, there are other ways of practicing, there are other ways of being,
right?
yeah, and infrastructure. So I think, you know, I was listening to you say those things and like kind of substituting like art and architecture, like you could insert those other terms in there.
They're very much tied.
We are still struggling with that, certainly.
So I went to Machu Picchu and thought about infrastructure in a completely different way. And then we saw that article around making, right, colonial architecture.
Making federal buildings beautiful again.
Colonial architecture, the vernacular of the United States. And I understand that kind of the history of Roman infrastructure and the history of Incan infrastructure are based on the geography. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm interested in the water systems that come in the global West, particularly around things like cement and flow and bath. And I'm also interested around ideas of the global South, particularly Machu Picchu, and the trickling down of sites. So it doesn't make sense to, I enjoy architects who understand that breadth of capability, because I think that their ethics are really guided by a more livable future. Mm-hmm. And they don't leave one behind. You know, there's no authority in a way that silences, you know, other kinds of history. So that's these are the architects that I'm in conversation with who are, you know, deeply knowledgeable about global human conditions. And, you know, so.
Yeah, I was just.
And I know people are going to class. This is not their like.
Should we open it
If
up?
you're hearing people leave.
Yeah, we definitely want to leave time for other people's questions too. One of the things I was thinking about is through your talk today and reading some of the things that you've written, you have this focus that's just permeates, I guess, the way that you work, that is learning and unlearning. Yeah. And it made me think a lot about like the pedagogical structures in a way that you've designed for experimenting. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those as well.
Sure, and I'm sorry, her name is Danielle Purefoy, my collaborator. sorry, Danielle. I'm just, I got good sleep last night, so I'm not sure why. I couldn't recall. To saturate you by taking but yes, Danielle's a brilliant woman who was actually practicing lawyer after Katrina, and as she was in New Orleans, she understood that she needed to get a degree in environmental science, a PhD in environmental science from Duke. So she had already been a practicing lawyer and went back to school to get her PhD in environmental science, and that's where we merged environmental justice as well. So, Danielle, your question.
Learning, unlearning.
Learning it. No, I'm with you. I think that I think we spoke about the Winter Wells School for Environmental Liberation, and it's a roving school that I've sort of come up with to invite architects, to invite sculptors, to invite artists to come in and respond to a particular prompt. And in that way, engineers come in who with the call by Ice Factory, engineers came in and talked about the production of ice, right? And they come in and talk about what does it mean to build that, both material and mechanical engineers who have different practices and different services come in and think about these issues through the practice of drawing. And so it allows a kind of condition where we're all trying to get to somewhere in this time of the class or the thinking through that helps us in our individual careers or vocations or practices, right? So the Winter Wells Drawing School for Environmental Liberation is one of those supplemental gatherings where creative people are thinking about, and we've had novelists, we've had poets, we've had makers all participate and add something to the conversation. And it allows an intense subjectivity to happen. And then you achieve an objectivity by a collective practice, right? So that practice of subjectivity to objectivity and both having, immediate political impacts is what the school is trying to look at.
Thank you.
Using abstraction more like a strategy.
Also, there are different registers of abstraction. There's political abstraction, there's a kind of economic abstraction, there's a quote-unquote phenomenal or pure abstraction. We also think about the different registers of abstraction and how one or place geographies and land can be abstracted, right? So how do systems of colonial conditions abstract a thing? How can vagrancy laws and the writers of vagrancy laws abstract a person? So the idea of abstraction in the contemporary, I think, has to be a throughway into understanding how how people achieve multiple systems that can exist simultaneously, how there can be extreme specialized knowledges that have those 100-year out plans, like we were talking about, installation of pipelines that intend to be 50, 70, 100-year experiences. And we have no idea, I have no idea. Well, I do. Since I've been alive, there's been about 2 million miles of oil pipeline laid since I've been alive. So in 46 years, it's at least been about 2 million miles of pipeline laid. So how does that happen with me not knowing anything about it, right? So I'm interested in the school, introducing that kind of understanding that distance, underwater and what happens then. So, that's a way to think about something that's being abstracted.
Taken away from you.
Or something that seems like magic, but it's not.
It's like it's by design that's happening.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think you are a catalyst for those, both the dialogues and through your work, those shifting of personal experience.
I think it's probably a good time to open it up to some other questions from the audience if folks have things they're curious about. Yeah, go for it.
Really fascinated by how you describe historical black spatial conditions and how you use them as a way to inspire how you work. I'm interested, how did you kind of develop that idea and arrive to those
The hyper shapes.
hypershapes? Yeah. I'm really fascinated by how you describe historical space that a particular person was in. And I'm just wondering the development that you went through to kind of come to these really inspiring ideas.
Yeah, it was Katrina. So I was teaching at Spelman. I think I was teaching painting or something at Spelman. And Katrina happened. And in 2 days, I had like 30 people at my house. And then Spike did When the Levees Broke, and then I saw it. And then there was a thing that came up called civic engineering and how the levees broke. That was, I had no idea how something like that could happen. And so I was like, what are we gonna do, right? And that's when I sort of started building the solar studios and trying to think about climate change and renewable resources and mobility and things like that. So I said, wow, people have been doing this for ages. And then I started thinking, well, if I can, provide a space for my friends to work and can have energy and we can move it as possible, and I can provide safe havens for people who are who are under conditions of infrastructure failures based on a history of under-engineered spaces that have a proximity to people of color, poor people. What have we done in the past? So I was like, oh, fugitives, oh, vagrancy, oh, movement, right? Because a lot of the reporting that was done after Katrina didn't explain what happened. It was like, oh, here are the people, and here's their shit underwater. Now here's the oil from the car seeping in, and there's this dead woman on top of a refrigerator, and here's this mark on a house, and here these white people that look like vagrants, who couldn't move, couldn't get out. And then it was just my first catastrophe that I had to provide food and shelter. So then it got me thinking about architecture, providing shelter. And then I got treated like shit by a few architects that couldn't deal with my learning curve. So I was like, okay, well, I'll do it alone. Now I'll find this trailer and go to the different institutions and build a thing. And then I did that, and I said, oh, wow. So now I can tell somebody how to build something, right? Through a drawing. And then I'm reading poetry all the time. And then I read a story about a fugitive, and I was like, oh, shit. I can draw that garret. And now that I can draw it, I can imagine what it is spatially, because I've built something around my own body now. So that happened. So I went all the way back. I started redesigning slave castles and thinking about, European architects, specifically Portuguese architects. And I started thinking about architecture of the global West and how it migrated to where my people are from, New Orleans. And I was like, this is a mess. We're in trouble. And then the complete dissemination of like Western wind laws, or I don't know what you all call it, but the idea that you can't understand better the southern United States more than indigenous people can. It's impossible for you to do. So you import these objects that aren't safe. So anyway, so that's what I began. I was like, oh, this isn't safe. But in these places, here goes Box Brown. He built a box with materials from the state, mailed himself with no postal service in a box, right? Without any control over that postal system. And then after he made it, he then painted a southern landscape and continued to perform his escape. And I was like, oh, Box Brown was a painter? And I was like, no. I have to be about the business of expanding. So that's how I got into it. It was just a, eyes open kind of thing,
There's a certain amount of like violence and also like putting yourself in the arena, like that the 30 people came and they were in your house, and the compression of that and the kind of immediacy of that prompting these other actions, I think is really, I mean, in so much of your work, you're showing like, this kind of continual putting yourself in the arena, right? The painting as a record of your movement.
Yeah.
I just think it's really compelling the way you describe it.
Any condition of individual or massive autonomy in the Americas by people of color is a violent condition, because that, by its resistance, threatens a history of colonialism, because it must displace other kinds of power, So those narratives, and there are tons of these narratives. I've just focused on 3. But now they're so people are just rich of the escape factor, rich with it, So that's how I, and those, I mean, it's a, architecture is, it's a risky business, So
You're all implicated. All right. All right. Other questions? Yeah, go for it.
I was really fascinated by your sculpture at Kalba, and this is a small, detailed question perhaps, but you talked about the importance of everything you took into consideration there. So you talked about the site, the sculpture, the geography, the infrastructure. I was wondering, you did touch on this, but did you also lay the groundwork there, which were the stones? I was thinking about how this is otherwise a very arid and sandy landscape, and how all of a sudden you've added these geometric abstractions maybe through the shapes, the color, and the texture of what's lying underneath your sculpture there.
yeah, the hardscape was already there.
Okay.
Yeah, I was really fortunate to get such a well-kept hardscape, right? Because the ground was, pretty leveled. And we had to move these, objects when I arrived. They were constructed there, and we had to move them after I arrived. So talking about sandstorms, we went through a few sandstorms. So I knew the sandstorms would be coming because of the mountain ridges, right? And we're by the water, and the wind load is the direction of the wind about every day swoop through into the water, right? So you would have these sandstorms that would then cover the sculptures, and the buildings are, rectilinear as well. So I was just putting another rectilinear thing next to another rectilinear thing next to another rectilinear thing, right? And so people were like, "Well, is that another building? Like, what? Can I get inside of it?" And I said, "No, you can't get inside of it." Well, you could get inside of it, but those kinds of things in that site, I didn't dust the sand off. It changed over time, the color of the surface. And the graphite, it's all covered in graphite that's been burnished. So I knew the ridges of the graphite would then catch some of the sand as well. So.
Other questions?
Sorry. One thing that you mentioned, I want to say it was about halfway through your presentation, was the idea of ancestors, and I thought that was really interesting. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how / if that's impacted your ideas, especially of time distance.
My ancestors? Impacted. They're just everywhere.
Ancestors are the concept. In my personal experience, this is going to sound like a big generalization, but in my experience, Black people tend to put a greater emphasis on their ancestors than white people. So I'm wondering if that impacts.
Well, your ancestors on the dollar bill. So I don't think it's a greater emphasis. I think it's a different kind of emphasis.
Okay.
and this is a question of geography. It's a question of culture, ethnicity. It's a question of belonging, a question of becoming. So white ancestorship, I don't know how you all will deal with that, but I know it's present. It's omnipresent. So I would argue that your ancestors have a much wider relationship to our lived experience today. And I have to continuously understand my ancestral present as a part of my becoming, but their stories, I have to place myself continuously in conditions of Black ancestorship so they are regarded as valuable and brilliant and genius, which is different than having my ancestors on all the currency of the state and the mountainsides.
We were at
all the electoral positions besides one. And then we're talking about just the global West, right? So there are ethnicities around the global West, and you all have your own problems, right? Internally, Ireland. That's a whole death and dying condition alone that never seems to be, I guess, talked about as ancestorship. Mm-hmm. But, as cliche as it is, the idea that it is a cliche is a false one.
Mm-hmm. So these are all identities that everyone's contending with every day, right?
Yeah.
So probably have time for one more question before we go out to the reception. I have a question.
No, just honestly, an appreciation. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you so much, TORKWASE.